Fall back, Olivia. You can't hold that hill alone. The voice cracked through the radio with a burst of static as Sergeant Olivia Hayes lay behind a line of weathered rocks near the top of Ridge 42. She lifted her eyes from the valley below and watched the distant movement unfolding across the rugged landscape. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the dry terrain, turning every ridge and ravine into a maze of shifting shapes. Around her, the position was quiet except for the steady wind pushing across the hilltop. The rest of her unit had already withdrawn to reinforce the main defensive line nearly half a mile away. Olivia was supposed to leave with them. Instead, she adjusted her spotting scope and calmly answered, "Negative. I'm staying." The radio went silent for a moment. Somewhere below, figures continued moving through the valley floor. More than anyone had expected. More than the intelligence reports had predicted. Olivia took a slow breath and checked her watch. 12 hours earlier, nobody believed she belonged on that hill in the first place. The briefing room had been crowded that morning. Maps covered the walls, and the smell of coffee mixed with the stale air of a temporary operations center. Officers reviewed routes, observation points, and fallback positions. When Captain Reed assigned Ridge 42 to Olivia, several soldiers exchanged glances. One of them actually laughed. "One sniper?" a young lieutenant asked. "On that hill alone?" Another soldier shook his head. "She won't last long if things get busy out there." Olivia had heard every word. She always did. Years in uniform had taught her that people revealed exactly what they thought when they assumed she wasn't listening. At 5'6" and carrying herself with quiet confidence rather than swagger, she rarely looked like the person others imagined when they heard the word sniper. She didn't argue during the briefing. She didn't defend herself. She simply studied the map and memorized every contour of the ridge she would soon occupy. By noon, she was already climbing toward the position. Ridge 42 overlooked nearly 3 miles of open terrain. Anyone moving through the valley would eventually pass within sight of the hill. That was exactly why the position mattered. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't comfortable. It was important. Olivia arrived carrying her rifle, her pack, and enough supplies for a long watch. The climb took nearly an hour under the relentless sun. When she reached the summit, she immediately began preparing the position. She measured distances. Identified landmarks. Noted wind patterns. Checked radio signals. Everything methodical. Everything deliberate. As daylight slowly shifted across the valley, she settled into the silence she preferred. There was something calming about observation work. No crowds. No noise. Just patience. Just focus. The radio had remained mostly quiet until 20 minutes ago. Then reports started arriving from multiple observation teams. Unusual movement. Unconfirmed activity. Growing concerns. Now Olivia watched through her optics as more figures appeared along the valley floor. She counted once. Then counted again. The number kept growing. Far more than anyone expected. The wind brushed against her face as she reached for the radio. Before speaking, she looked across the vast landscape stretching toward the horizon. The hill felt smaller than it had an hour ago. Much smaller. "Command," she said calmly. "You need to take another look at those numbers." A pause followed. Then came the reply. "How many do you see?" Olivia continued watching the valley below. Her expression never changed. But for the first time all day, even she realized something significant was about to happen. "More than enough," she answered quietly. "And they're heading this way." The operations center fell unusually quiet after Olivia's transmission. Captain Reed stood over a digital map illuminated by pale blue screens while analysts compared incoming reports from observation teams scattered across the region. None of the numbers matched. One report suggested a routine movement pattern. Another indicated a larger concentration gathering several miles south. The uncertainty made everyone uneasy. Ridge 42 sat directly between those reports, and Olivia Hayes was the only person with a clear view of what was happening. "Confirm your count," Reed said through the radio. Static crackled before Olivia answered. "Still observing." Her voice remained steady. That calmness somehow made the situation feel more serious. Reed glanced toward Lieutenant Mason. The young officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. 12 hours earlier, he had been the loudest critic in the briefing room. Now he stared at the map without speaking. Olivia remained stretched behind the rocks at the top of the ridge. The valley below seemed almost peaceful at first glance. Long shadows covered the dry ground while the evening light painted the distant hills in shades of gold and amber. But through her optics, the pattern became obvious. Small groups were moving with purpose. They were not wandering. They were not lost. They were heading toward specific terrain features that could provide concealment and observation. Olivia adjusted the focus and continued studying the movement. Years of experience had taught her that details mattered. Most people looked at a landscape and saw hills. She saw routes. Distances. Angles. Opportunities. Risks. She reached into her pack and removed a weathered notebook filled with measurements she had recorded throughout the afternoon. Wind direction. Elevation references. Landmarks. Every page reflected hours of preparation that nobody else would ever notice. Far below, more movement appeared near a dry creek bed. Olivia counted again. The number increased. She keyed the radio. "Command, additional groups entering from the west." Captain Reed exchanged a glance with the intelligence officer. The room became even quieter. "Are you certain?" he asked. Olivia almost smiled. It was the same question she had heard throughout her career. Not because people doubted her professionalism. Because they underestimated how much she noticed. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I am certain." Several seconds passed. Then Reed made a decision. "Hold observation. Reinforcements are unavailable at this time." Olivia expected that answer. Every unit nearby was already committed elsewhere. She set the radio aside and continued scanning the valley. The wind grew stronger. Dust drifted across the ridge in thin waves. Somewhere behind her, a loose piece of stone rolled down the slope and disappeared into the silence. For a moment she thought about the briefing room earlier that morning. She remembered the doubtful expressions. The whispers. The assumptions. None of it bothered her anymore. Experience had taught her that confidence earned quietly lasted longer than confidence announced loudly. As darkness slowly approached, the valley changed again. The scattered groups that had seemed disconnected now appeared coordinated. Distances closed. Positions aligned. A larger picture was forming. Olivia felt the same instinct that had protected her throughout years of service. Something important was unfolding. Something bigger than anyone at headquarters currently understood. She lifted her binoculars one more time and focused on a distant ridgeline nearly 2 miles away. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then a brief reflection caught her eye. Just a flicker. Gone almost instantly. Olivia froze. Her attention narrowed. A second reflection appeared several yards away from the first. Then another. She lowered the binoculars slowly. For the first time that day, concern crossed her face. The valley was not the real problem. The hills beyond it were beginning to wake up. Olivia kept her binoculars fixed on the distant ridgeline long after the brief flashes disappeared. Most people would have dismissed them as sunlight reflecting from rocks. She knew better. Natural reflections were random. These had appeared in a pattern. Deliberate. Measured. Intentional. The fading daylight continued to drain color from the valley, replacing the golden afternoon with long bands of gray shadow. Ridge 42 suddenly felt far more isolated than it had an hour earlier. She reached for the radio once again. "Command, I have activity on the northern ridgeline approximately 2 miles out." Captain Reed responded immediately. "Can you identify it?" Olivia remained silent for several seconds as she adjusted her optics. The terrain was difficult to read at that distance. The ridgeline looked empty. Still, her instincts refused to let it go. "Negative identification," she answered. "But something is there." Back at the operations center, several officers exchanged uncertain looks. The intelligence team had no reports indicating unusual activity in that sector. Lieutenant Mason folded his arms and stared at the map. "We are chasing shadows now," he muttered quietly. Reed heard him but said nothing. Earlier that morning, he might have agreed. Now he was not so sure. Olivia had already reported movements that other observation teams failed to notice. Each time, follow-up checks confirmed her assessment. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. On the ridge, Olivia lowered her binoculars and scanned the valley with her own eyes. Years of experience had taught her not to rely entirely on equipment. Sometimes the human eye caught relationships that technology missed. The landscape spread before her like a giant puzzle. Dry creek beds. Narrow passes. Rocky outcroppings. Every feature connected to another. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together. The groups in the valley were not moving toward the main defensive line. They were positioning themselves around it. Olivia opened her notebook and compared several sketches she had made earlier. Distances. Routes. Terrain advantages. The realization arrived gradually. Then all at once. Her eyes narrowed. "Command," she said. "I think we are looking at something larger." Reed stepped closer to the radio console. "Explain." Olivia studied the map she had drawn by hand throughout the afternoon. "The movements are coordinated. The valley groups and the northern ridgeline activity are connected. They are using terrain to stay hidden from aerial observation." Silence followed. The analysts immediately began reviewing satellite imagery. Several screens changed. New layers appeared. Fresh calculations were made. Even then, nobody could see what Olivia was seeing from the ridge itself. Darkness continued advancing across the valley. The temperature dropped noticeably. A cool wind swept across the rocks and carried dust through the air. Olivia zipped her jacket and checked her watch. She had been observing for hours without leaving her position. Fatigue should have been setting in. Instead, she felt more alert than ever. The situation demanded it. Then she noticed something else. Movement on the eastern slope. Different from the others. Slower. More careful. Olivia focused her optics. A small group emerged briefly before disappearing behind terrain again. They were not following the same route as the others. They were heading toward a narrow passage less than a mile from Ridge 42. Olivia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The picture was becoming clearer. And it was becoming more concerning. She pressed the radio button one more time. "Captain, I need you to listen carefully." The room fell silent once again. Every officer turned toward the speaker. Olivia kept her eyes fixed on the darkening valley. "This is not a routine movement." She paused. "I think Ridge 42 was never supposed to be the observation point." Another brief silence followed. Then she spoke the words that changed the atmosphere in the operations center completely. "I think it is the objective." The statement hit the operations center like a sudden change in weather. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Captain Reed stared at the map while analysts rapidly overlaid new terrain data across their screens. If Olivia was correct, Ridge 42 was not simply a lookout position. It was the key piece of ground controlling visibility across multiple valleys and access routes. Losing it would create a blind spot stretching for miles. "How certain are you?" Reed finally asked. Olivia never looked away from the darkening landscape. "Certain enough that I would not leave this hill." The answer was simple. Direct. It carried no drama. Somehow that made it more convincing. Reed exhaled slowly and turned toward Lieutenant Mason. Earlier that day, Mason had questioned whether a single sniper belonged on the ridge at all. Now he remained silent. Every new report seemed to confirm Olivia's observations. Back on the hill, the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the western mountains. The valley transformed into a sea of shadows. Olivia switched to low-light optics and continued tracking movement. The groups below were no longer difficult to follow. Their routes formed a pattern. Small elements advanced while others paused. Then positions shifted again. Each movement appeared connected to another. Someone was coordinating them carefully. Olivia opened her notebook and began marking fresh observations beside the sketches she had made earlier. Distance estimates. Terrain references. Timing. She recorded everything. A calm routine developed despite the growing tension. Observe. Record. Reassess. Repeat. The process steadied her thoughts. Years earlier, one of her instructors had told her that pressure revealed habits. Poor habits became mistakes. Good habits became survival. Olivia never forgot that lesson. A sudden transmission interrupted the silence. "Olivia, this is Reed. We are attempting to redirect support assets to your location." She immediately recognized the careful wording. Attempting. Not sending. Attempting. Resources were stretched thin. Reinforcements would not arrive quickly. If they arrived at all. "Understood," she replied. The radio clicked off again. Wind swept across the ridge with increasing force. Temperatures continued falling. Olivia secured loose equipment and adjusted her position behind the rocks. She knew every inch of the hill now. Every depression. Every ridgeline. Every place offering visibility or concealment. Hours of preparation were beginning to pay dividends. Then she noticed something new. The valley movement had slowed. At first, that seemed encouraging. But the longer she watched, the more concerned she became. Activity had not stopped. It had disappeared. The groups were no longer crossing open ground. They had reached cover. Olivia slowly lowered her optics. The realization settled heavily in her mind. The first phase was complete. Whatever happened next would be different. She keyed the radio once more. "Command, movement has changed." Reed answered immediately. "Explain." Olivia continued scanning the darkness. "They are no longer maneuvering through the valley." A pause followed. "Where did they go?" Reed asked. Olivia looked toward several terrain features surrounding the hill. Dry creek beds. Rock formations. Narrow approaches hidden from direct observation. Routes she had identified earlier in the day. Routes leading toward her position. "Closer," she answered quietly. Several hundred miles away from the comfort of certainty, Captain Reed felt his stomach tighten. On Ridge 42, Olivia adjusted her optics one more time. Then she spotted the first unmistakable sign. A faint light appeared briefly near the base of the hill before vanishing again. A moment later, another appeared somewhere else. Then a third. Olivia remained perfectly still. The waiting was over. Whatever had been forming throughout the afternoon had finally reached the ridge. Olivia remained motionless as the faint lights disappeared into the darkness surrounding the hill. She had seen enough. The activity below was no longer a possibility or a theory. It was real. The groups she had tracked all afternoon had finally reached their positions. Somewhere beyond the rocks and dry washes surrounding Ridge 42, people were waiting. Watching. Preparing. She checked her watch. The first light had appeared less than 3 minutes ago. Already the atmosphere felt different. The hill itself seemed to be holding its breath. A transmission broke the silence. "Olivia, report." Captain Reed's voice carried a tension she had not heard earlier. She lifted the radio. Multiple indicators around the base of the ridge. Movement has stopped. They are in position. Several seconds passed before Reed responded. "Can you estimate numbers?" Olivia looked across the dark terrain. The honest answer was that she could not. Not anymore. Earlier she could count movement. Now the landscape had absorbed it. The terrain concealed too much. "No reliable estimate," she said. "Only that there are more than we initially believed." Inside the operations center, analysts continued comparing incoming information. Fresh reports from distant observation posts were arriving every few minutes. Most confirmed unusual activity across a broad area. The picture was finally catching up to what Olivia had already recognized hours earlier. Lieutenant Mason stood beside the map table, unusually quiet. He remembered questioning the assignment that morning. Now he could not stop thinking about it. One soldier. One hill. One position everyone assumed was secondary. Yet somehow Olivia had become the first person to understand what was unfolding. Back on the ridge, the temperature continued dropping. The wind shifted direction, carrying colder air across the rocks. Olivia adjusted her gear and moved carefully between prepared observation points she had established throughout the afternoon. Every position offered a slightly different angle. Every angle revealed something new. Preparation mattered. It always had. Earlier, while others questioned whether she belonged on the hill, she had spent hours learning it. Memorizing it. Understanding it. Now that work was paying off. A faint sound drifted through the darkness. Olivia froze. It was distant. Easy to miss. Most people would have ignored it. She listened again. There it was. Brief. Subtle. Then gone. Her eyes shifted toward a narrow approach on the eastern side of the ridge. Minutes later another sound followed from a different direction. Then another. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to confirm what she already suspected. Activity was increasing. Slowly. Methodically. She keyed the radio. "Command, I am seeing coordination from multiple directions now." Reed answered immediately. "Reinforcement requests have been approved, but arrival times remain uncertain." Olivia nodded even though nobody could see her. The answer changed nothing. She had never expected immediate support. The reality of the situation was simple. Ridge 42 belonged to her for now. The responsibility settled comfortably on her shoulders. Not because it was easy. Because it was familiar. Throughout her career she had learned that difficult moments rarely announced themselves with dramatic warnings. They arrived quietly. One observation at a time. One decision at a time. One overlooked detail at a time. Suddenly a new transmission appeared across the radio network. Another observation team several miles away had reported unusual movement of their own. Then a second report followed. Then a third. Olivia listened carefully as information flowed through the channel. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Whatever operation was unfolding extended far beyond her hill. Yet somehow Ridge 42 remained at the center of it. Olivia looked out across the darkness once more. The valley had vanished beneath the night. The distant ridgelines were barely visible silhouettes against the sky. Then she noticed something that made her grip the radio tighter. The scattered lights she had observed earlier were beginning to move. The tiny points of light drifted across the darkness like silent signals passing between unseen observers. Olivia watched them through her optics and immediately recognized the pattern. They were not random. One light appeared, disappeared, and moments later another emerged farther along the slope. The movement traced routes leading toward key terrain around the hill. Someone was communicating without using radios. Someone wanted to remain invisible. Olivia recorded every position in her notebook. The pages were now crowded with sketches, arrows, and distance estimates gathered throughout the day. What had begun as routine observation had become something entirely different. She pressed the radio button. "Command, the activity is increasing." Captain Reed answered at once. "We are tracking additional reports from neighboring sectors." "You were right about the coordination." Olivia glanced toward the northern ridgeline where the first unusual reflections had appeared hours earlier. The area remained dark and quiet. Too quiet. Experience had taught her that silence often carried its own warning. "Any update on support?" she asked. Reed hesitated. That hesitation told her everything before he even spoke. "Units are moving, but they are still some distance away." Olivia nodded to herself. She had expected as much. The reality remained unchanged. For the foreseeable future, Ridge 42 depended entirely on the person standing on it. The wind strengthened again, rattling loose gravel across the rocks. Clouds drifted across the night sky and occasionally blocked the stars. Each time the darkness deepened, the landscape seemed to disappear completely. Then the clouds would pass and familiar shapes returned. Olivia moved carefully between observation points, checking every approach she had identified during daylight. Hours earlier those routes had seemed empty. Now each one felt important. Every shadow deserved attention. Every silence required explanation. Back at the operations center, analysts continued assembling pieces of a puzzle that Olivia had started solving long before anyone else. Digital maps now displayed multiple indicators across a wide area. Lieutenant Mason studied the information in disbelief. "She saw this first from a single hill?" he asked quietly. No one answered. The evidence spoke for itself. Olivia remained focused on the terrain. Fatigue tugged at the edges of her concentration, but discipline pushed it aside. She drank a small amount of water, reviewed her notes, and returned to her optics. Routine mattered. Small habits created stability when uncertainty grew. Then something unexpected happened. The lights stopped moving. One by one they vanished into the darkness until none remained visible. Olivia waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Then 2. Nothing. The sudden absence felt more concerning than the movement itself. She scanned the slopes again. No lights. No visible activity. No obvious explanation. "Command," she said quietly. Everything just went dark. Reed responded immediately. "Meaning?" Olivia continued searching the terrain. "The signals have stopped. Completely." Another pause followed. Somewhere inside the operations center, conversations grew quieter. Nobody liked uncertainty. Nobody trusted sudden silence. Olivia slowly lowered her optics and listened to the wind. At first she heard nothing unusual. Then a faint sound reached her from somewhere below the western slope. It lasted only a moment before fading away. She turned toward it instinctively. Seconds later a second sound emerged from a different direction. Then another. Not loud. Not threatening. Just enough to suggest movement where moments earlier there had been none. Olivia looked across the dark ridge line surrounding her position and felt a realization settle into place. The lights had never been the main event. They had only been the preparation. Olivia stayed perfectly still as the faint sounds drifted through the darkness surrounding the hill. Hours of observation had taught her an important lesson. The most dangerous moments were rarely the loudest ones. They were the quiet transitions when patterns changed and assumptions stopped being reliable. She adjusted her position behind the rocks and scanned each approach route again. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. The terrain looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Dry slopes. Scattered boulders. Narrow draws cutting through the hillside. Yet everything felt different now. The silence had weight. The radio crackled unexpectedly. "Olivia, this is Reed. Status update." She kept her eyes on the western approach while answering. "Activity continues. The signals are gone, but movement has not stopped." Reed paused. "Can you estimate what happens next?" Olivia considered the question carefully. Earlier in the day she might have offered possibilities. Now she felt confident enough to offer something stronger. "They are no longer positioning themselves," she said. "They are transitioning." The operations center grew quiet again. Several analysts exchanged uneasy looks. Nobody liked that answer. Transitioning meant planning was over. Action usually followed. On Ridge 42, the wind shifted once more. Clouds rolled across the sky and covered the stars. Darkness deepened until the valley below seemed to vanish entirely. Olivia switched between observation devices and continued monitoring every route she had identified during daylight. Her notebook remained open beside her. The pages were filled with sketches, arrows, timing notes, and terrain references. What had seemed excessive earlier now felt essential. Every observation connected to another. Every detail supported a larger picture. Then the radio hissed again. This time the transmission was broken. Fragments of voices emerged through static before disappearing completely. Olivia adjusted the frequency and tried again. Nothing. She checked her equipment twice. Then a third time. The result remained the same. Communication quality was deteriorating. "Command, radio traffic is becoming unstable," she reported. Reed's voice returned, weaker than before. "We are seeing similar issues elsewhere." The transmission faded briefly. "Maintain contact if possible." Olivia acknowledged the message and looked toward the distant ridgeline where she had first spotted unusual reflections earlier that afternoon. It seemed impossible that only a few hours had passed. The situation had evolved so quickly that the morning felt like another lifetime. She remembered the briefing room. The skeptical expressions. The doubts about assigning one person to such an important position. Those conversations no longer mattered. Reality had settled the argument. A sudden sound from the southern slope pulled her attention away. It lasted only a second. Then another followed from a different direction. This time there was no mistaking the pattern. The activity was spreading around the hill. Multiple approaches. Multiple positions. Multiple directions. Olivia slowly exhaled and reached for her notebook one final time. She drew several new marks across the map she had created by hand. When she finished, she stared at the page for several seconds. The routes formed a shape she did not like. Not because it surprised her. Because it confirmed what she already suspected. She lifted the radio. "Captain, I need you to understand something." Static filled the channel before Reed answered. "Go ahead." Olivia looked out across the darkness surrounding Ridge 42. This hill is no longer being observed. She paused. Her voice remained calm. Steady. Certain. It is being surrounded. For several seconds, nobody responded to Olivia's transmission. The words seemed to hang in the air between Ridge 42 and the operations center miles away. Finally Captain Reed's voice returned through a blanket of static. "Are you certain?" Olivia looked down at the notebook resting beside her. Every observation from the past 12 hours pointed toward the same conclusion. The routes. The signals. The coordinated movement. The disappearing lights. None of it was random. Yes, sir, she replied. I am certain. In the operations center, Lieutenant Mason stared silently at the map. Earlier that day he had questioned whether a single sniper belonged on the ridge. Now he found himself watching multiple screens built almost entirely around Olivia's reports. Analysts continued feeding new information into the system, and every update seemed to support her assessment. Ridge 42 had become the focal point of the entire situation. Back on the hill, Olivia remained calm. The darkness surrounding her position no longer felt mysterious. It felt organized. That distinction mattered. Unknown dangers could create fear. Organized activity required analysis. Analysis was something she trusted. She moved carefully to another observation point and studied the terrain once more. The clouds had begun to thin, allowing faint starlight to illuminate portions of the landscape. Small details emerged from the darkness. Rock formations. Dry channels. Elevated positions overlooking the ridge. Every feature offered information. Every feature suggested intent. The radio crackled again. This time the signal was weaker than before. Olivia, support elements are moving as fast as possible. Reed paused as interference briefly interrupted the transmission. Estimated arrival remains uncertain. Olivia acknowledged the message without frustration. She understood military realities better than most. Distance could not be shortened simply because a situation became urgent. The units were coming. The question was whether they would arrive soon enough to matter. She checked her watch. Midnight was approaching. The day that began with skepticism and routine planning had transformed into something entirely different. Her position on the ridge had shifted from observation to responsibility. Yet she felt no resentment. No anxiety. Just focus. She remembered something her first instructor had once told her during training. The instructor had said that confidence was not believing nothing could go wrong. Confidence was believing you could think clearly when it did. Olivia had carried that lesson through every assignment of her career. Now it returned again. A faint sound drifted across the eastern slope. Then another from the north. Then one from the west. The pattern continued spreading around the hill. Not chaotic. Not rushed. Deliberate. Olivia updated her notes and traced several routes with her finger. The shape forming around Ridge 42 had become impossible to ignore. What surprised her most was the patience behind it. Whoever planned this operation was willing to invest hours into positioning and preparation. That level of discipline concerned her far more than speed ever could. She lifted her optics one more time and focused on a distant ridgeline. For a brief moment she thought she saw movement. Then it vanished. A few seconds later another shape appeared somewhere else. Then another. Olivia slowly lowered the optics. The picture was finally complete. The surrounding activity was not closing in from one direction. It was developing from every direction at once. She pressed the radio button. Static filled the channel. She tried again. Nothing. The connection had disappeared completely. Olivia looked out across the dark terrain, now alone with her observations. Then she glanced at the notebook that had quietly documented every warning sign before anyone else recognized them. The hill was isolated. Communication was fading. The circle around Ridge 42 was tightening. And for the first time all night, there was no one left to convince except herself. The first hint of dawn appeared along the eastern horizon as Olivia remained on Ridge 42, watching the darkness slowly surrender to pale gray light. The long night had felt endless. Communications had faded. The surrounding activity had continued. Yet the hill still stood exactly where it had the day before, and so did she. As visibility improved, details that had been hidden by darkness began revealing themselves. Routes she had mapped. Positions she had identified. Terrain features she had memorized hour by hour. Everything matched the picture she had assembled alone. Far below, movement continued across the valley, but now the pattern was unmistakable. What seemed confusing to others had become clear to her long before sunrise. She reached for the radio one more time. To her surprise, a burst of static answered back. Then a voice emerged. Weak. Broken. But recognizable. Olivia, this is Reed. Do you copy? Relief never showed on her face, but she felt it. I copy. Several seconds of interference followed before Reed spoke again. Support elements are approaching your sector. Olivia looked toward the distant ridgelines. Tiny shapes were beginning to appear against the morning light. After hours of uncertainty, the situation was finally changing. Back at the operations center, the atmosphere was completely different from the previous day. Analysts crowded around maps covered with notes originating from a single source. Olivia's source. The routes she had documented. The timing she had recorded. The observations she had insisted were important. Every piece had helped commanders understand the larger picture. Lieutenant Mason stood silently near the map table. He remembered his words from the briefing room. He remembered questioning the assignment. Questioning the hill. Questioning the soldier chosen to hold it. The memory sat heavily on his conscience. On the ridge, Olivia packed away her notebook. The pages were worn from constant use. Dust covered the edges. Small pencil marks filled nearly every inch of paper. Yet those pages now represented something much larger than simple observations. They represented preparation. Patience. Discipline. The qualities nobody noticed when they judged a person too quickly. As the sun climbed higher, the first support vehicles became visible in the distance. Their arrival brought a sense of stability that had been missing throughout the night. Soon afterward, Captain Reed himself arrived at the ridge. He stepped out and surveyed the terrain surrounding the hill. Then he looked toward Olivia. She appeared exactly as she had during the briefing the previous morning. Calm. Professional. Unassuming. Reed glanced at the notebook in her hands. You tracked all of this yourself? Olivia nodded. Most of it. Reed looked across the valley once more. You saw what nobody else saw. She considered the statement for a moment before answering. The signs were there. A short time later, Lieutenant Mason climbed the final slope leading to the observation position. He stopped several feet away. For a moment neither person spoke. The wind moved quietly across the ridge. Finally Mason broke the silence. I was wrong. Olivia looked at him without judgment. Without satisfaction. Without resentment. Mason shook his head. I thought the assignment was a mistake. He glanced across the terrain surrounding them. Turns out you understood this hill better